Chapter 45. 3 seconds. That's how long it took for the battlefield to be completely reshaped. In the first second, the first Hokage wordlessly slammed his hands into the ground as the second Hokage used a single hand seal. In the second, Tenzo encased their group in a wooden sphere of protection as the world around them trembled in warning. And in the third, the walls that made up the underground base were torn apart from the inside out as invasive roots took hold while water burst from the air, combining to unleash the wrath of nature. The wooden shell cracked and splintered loudly, straining to avoid being crushed as the shinobi that crafted it braced the sides and gritted his teeth. Then it stopped seconds later. Silence ensued until Tenzo split the shell's casing in half for them to escape now that the roots that sprang up from below had stopped trying to entwine it and violently crush them to death. They vacated it and landed on the first sylvan footing they could find, only to see that the muddy landscape surrounding the base, which had been warped by Jiraiya's swamp of the underworld initially, had been even further twisted from its natural state. It was now filled with murky water that thinned the mud and hardy trees that rose up at the former Hokage techniques. Even the air was tinged with the scent of decaying matter, adding to the illusion that it had been an old locale forged through nature and time, rather than something crafted within the span of 10 minutes by men, or undead men, to be specific. The sight would have been stolen the breath of average shinobi. And in that moment of doing so, they would have been killed as skewer-thin streams of water speared from the swamp with a rapid spin, meant to drill through them. But, as none of the gathered shinobi were average, they eluded the skewering drills that bore cleanly into the thick branches they were perched on and sprung into combat. Kakashi revealed his inherited Sharingan as he landed on the water's surface, and the Tomo spun to life. The flow of chakra revealed before him allowed him to avoid the needles of water that sprung from the murky depths with well-timed leaps before rushing towards where second Hokage was hidden behind a genjutsu atop the water. Engaging the revenant with kunai in hand, he refused to give him an inch to make another hand seal. At the same time, Might Guy's muscles felt a familiar strain as the gates of opening and healing opened at once to empower him against the first Hokage. The flood of chakra that surged through his body allowed for him to land a fierce kick that slammed into the undead Kage's chest and sent him skirting across the water and into one of his own trees. Bindings of wood then coiled around him as Tenzo came from behind, pinning him into place for Guy to land a stronger blow. They didn't last a second as the first Hokage tensed his muscle and broke free, meeting Guy's flying kick with his palm to stop it. He then grabbed hold of his ankle and slammed him into the tree hard enough to break it in half. Guy gritted his teeth before opening the gate of life and pain, using the further bolstered strength to pull his leg free and tear off the revenant's arm in the process. He then slammed his fist into the first Hokage's face, and the revenant went sailing back, only to be struck again from behind and be sent flying forward. Then he was struck from the side by a green blur, then from the bottom, and then from the top. Over and over, Might Guy struck from all angles with hammer-like blows before he struck downwards a final time. The blow carried enough force that the moment the first Hokage's body hit the water it ruptured from the impact. The revenant hit the bottom of the swamp and created a deep depression, broken and battered. Then the water rushed back inwards, obscuring him from sight. It was seemingly over until wooden spears rose from beneath the surface. Guy avoided them but was caught as the first Hokage appeared behind him and lashed out with a kick that would have shattered a lesser man's spine. Guy bore with it as he landed on the water's surface and then struck back just as hard. With the two undead Hokage occupied, only Orochimaru and Jiraiya were left to fight alone. The resurrected Snake Sannin, using the body of his former apprentice, drew a katana from inside of his mouth and brought it around for Jiraiya's head. The Toad Sage deflected it with the use of a kunai in one hand before bringing his leg up and thrusting it forward like a spear. The bottom of his wooden sandals smashed into the slender body and would have caved in Orochimaru's chest if he hadn't jumped back with the blow. Jiraiya then spun around so that his long mane of hair was facing his former teammate and sent his chakra into it. The hair strands went rigid as the chakra hardened them into needles. Then he jettisoned them forward in a deathly spray. There was no dodging it. Even going under the murky water would simply result in the needles skewering him from above. So instead Orochimaru exhaled after filling his lungs with wind chakra and bellowed out a gale that sent the ivory needles flying back. Jiraiya countered the sear rank technique by spinning around while forming hand seals and unleashing a flame technique of the same rank. The moment the flames met the wind, they swelled and turned into a raging inferno that would have swallowed Orochimaru whole if he didn't drop down into the water. Even then, steam filled the section of the swamp they were in as the flames evaporated the water. Charred trees caught in its wake, smoldered and collapsed into the depths, hindering any attempt to listen for his movements in the water. Feeling the wet heat condense against his skin, Jiraiya abandoned the use of his eyes to instead clasp his hands together, as though to pray, releasing a translucent dome that expanded around him. The expanding barrier allowed him to detect the presence of others within it, regardless of what method Orochimaru used to hide. Sure enough, it quickly caught up to Orochimaru's presence beneath the water. At the same time, he felt a large figure rushing towards him from that direction and barely had time to leap up before the surface of the water was broken. It was a large snake summoning, mouth gaping wide and ready to swallow him whole. Unable to waste time with it, Jiraiya spat out as much toad oil as he could down its throat and then followed it up with an explosive tag. The flames that were born from within swallowed the serpent whole as the toad sage landed and then clasped his hands again to reactivate the detection barrier. Orochimaru was moving again above the water's surface. Jiraiya couldn't let the man get away again, so naturally he gave chase with the intention of using a sealing scroll he'd prepared just for Orochimaru, under the assumption that he had become weaker after changing bodies. Anko's body may have been compatible, but completely transferring your soul and chakra to someone else just had to have a drawback somewhere. He redoubled his efforts as they approached the edge of the swamp, only for Orochimaru to look over his shoulder at Jiraiya. And in that brief moment, the toad sage caught the faintest hint of a smirk on his face. It set off alarms in his head and made him reconsider what he was doing. Orochimaru was a slippery snake because he was cautious. Jiraiya had chased the man for a long time now, and it was only by hiding his presence and letting the snake Sannin be caught by surprise that they'd managed to face one another in the village. Even then, they used the element of surprise and his own barrier to kill him. So why did this feel wrong? I'm missing something, he realized. There had to be a reason that Orochimaru was running away. He had to have been waiting for them, but why was that the case? If he was weakened, why wait for them to arrive when he could have slipped away sooner? Did he intend to use the first and second Hokage to kill them after he left the expendable ones to soften them up? If that was the case, he could have just left them there and given them the order to attack on sight. Not wait until they entered the room. Unless, damn it. Jiraiya skid to a stop as the pieces fit together and created a shadow clone to remain behind while he rushed back into the swamp. The clone glared at the figure of Orochimaru as he stood there. A shadow clone? The snake Sannin shook his head. I'm a little insulted. Drop the act, the clone said. You're not him, despite playing the part. If I had to guess, you're that brat he keeps around, Kabuto. A look of brief surprise crossed Orochimaru's face. It then warped into an amused smile. And here I thought that I had imitated him perfectly. Then again, Lord Orochimaru warned me that you wouldn't be fooled for long. I have to ask, what gave it away? Orochimaru knows when to go to ground, and he wouldn't be sitting on a throne waiting for us to come to him unless he thought he could take us all. You did this to buy time for him, and if you've taken after him then you're not really here as well. Probably one of his expendable flunkies you've rendered brain dead and turned into a puppet or something. In my defense, the corpse had been prepared for some time now, and I simply put it use. Nevertheless, my task has been complete. The first and second Hokage have been set to kill all of you. Should they lose track of you, they will then go on to attack the village, and the only way to release the technique is if Lord Orochimaru deems to. It is our victory. That said, the modified corpse gave a bow to the shadow clone. Then it immediately exploded as the clone rushed in to at least wipe it off the face of the planet. Thus both facsimiles of the combatants were removed from the battle. The original Jiraiya gritted his teeth in anger as he inherited the memories from the clone. Again, Orochimaru had made fools of them and would escape reprisal for now. He was always one step ahead, getting away with causing pain to others, and it infuriated Jiraiya. But he grounded his anger. Pushed it aside as he grabbed hold of the scroll meant to seal away Orochimaru and made his way towards where the fighting continued. It could still be used if he repurposed it. Ruoer. The train of thought was scattered by the thunderous shrieking of dragons. 4 of them roared at the top of their lungs, manifestations of the water dragon and wood dragon techniques brought forth by the undead pair of Hokage and Tenzo with Kakashi. Coiling their serpentine bodies around one another, they battled by snapping their jaws in a contest of power as they tore one another apart. While they were preoccupied, Might Guy appeared in a blur through the opening with his nunchucks chambered. The moment he swung them both, the Revenant's entire upper bodies were gone from the sheer force of the impact backed by 4 gates. He swung again to scatter the lower halves of their bodies as well, and then leapt back towards the others as Jiraiya arrived. "Lord Jiraiya, did you apprehend Orochimaru?" Guy asked, his skin red as blood pumped through his body at an accelerated pace under the fourth gate's opening. "That wasn't him. It was a distraction." A grimace that matched the notable disdain in his voice formed on his face as he watched the revenants begin to reform themselves. "Right now we need to stop these two or they'll go on to destroy the village." "Easier said than done, sir," Kakashi said. "They're closer to machines rather than living beings. However, they merely reconstitute themselves and continue to attack when killed. Our best option would likely to be seal them away. I can use the sealing scroll I prepared for Orochimaru," he said as the two finished reforming. "Tenzo, I'll need you to make a coffin just big enough to fit both of them." "Guy, Kakashi, pin them down for a second." "Sir," they all responded at once. Then there was no more room for discussion after that as the two undead Hokage began their attack again. And this time they escalated even further. The second Hokage began to exhale a powerful stream of water in front of him that broke the surface of the murky swamp and then began to churn it violently into an expanding, spiraling wall that threatened to sweep them away. Their primary means of escape was cut off as well as a wooden wall emerged around them to form a dome that blotted out the moonlight and encased them in darkness. It was a combination attack meant to grind them into a smear against a wooden cage, while the two behind it remained protected within the eye of the hurricane. With no hesitation, the elites of the Leaf Village acted. To meet the combined efforts of two of their village's greatest shinobi, even as shades of themselves raised from the dead, they held nothing back. Might Guy opened up the 5th, 6th, and 7th gates, while Kakashi's mirror wheel eye warped into its kaleidoscopic form. Chakra and sweat bloomed in the form of a magnificent green aura that threatened to overtake them all as it displaced the water that steadily grated at it. Guy took on a stance with his fist, chambered back and tensed his muscles, prepared to release it. At the same time, Kakashi swiveled around and then fixated his eye on the wooden dome encasing them. Everything at the center of his view began to distort as he used it as a lens and pushed out all the chakra he could to force Kamui to activate, doing his best to ignore the sensation that was like getting a kunai plunging through his eye and into his skull. Space warped and was drawn into itself to create a perfectly shaped hole as Kakashi then passed out, blood trailing from his eye. Jiraiya caught hold of him and then rushed out of the hole with Tenzo, leaving Guy behind. The moment they were cleared, Tenzo encased them in another shell of protection as thick as he could and forced it as deep as he could into the ground so they were out of the blast zone as Guy unleashed a single punch as fast as he could. And the daytime tiger burst the wooden cage it was confined within apart. The pressure expanded to where it caught the entirety of the swamp and leveled it from the sheer force of the blow. Nothing remained but an expansive crater the size of a lake as Might Guy landed, unharmed but sweat glistening from his brow. Every bone in his body was rattling from the shockwave and the strain of the chakra that threaded every inch of his being tore apart his muscle fibers. The fight was out of him for the time being, leaving him to watch as the two revenants began to reform right in front of him. That was when two wooden halves emerged from the ground beneath them and snapped shut like the jaws of a shark, sealing them inside. The shell that had been buried within the earth popped out and split open so that Tenzo could thrust his hand into the coffin snare he created, warping his fingers to form wooden bands to wrap around it. "Now," he said, straining as he wrestled control over the wood against a first Hokage. "Do it now." Jiraiya unfurled the scroll with a sharp motion using his left hand as he bit into his right thumb. He then ran his finger along the scroll to mark it with his blood before he formed a one-handed gesture and spoke with chakra threading his voice to activate it. "Let the evil be sealed within." The words carried his intention as the unfurled scroll wrapped around the coffin like a winding serpent. Sealing script on the paper bled off of it, the ink running over the coffin and impressing upon it a central sealing sigil that was bordered by dozens of lines that ran both vertically and horizontally over the wood. The struggle stopped the moment it was done, and the sealing script shone with a purple haze as it drank in his chakra until there was little to give. "It's done," Jiraiya said, sighing with a shuddering breath as chakra exhaustion was on the verge of setting in. "That's a multi-layered seal, packed with everything that I thought would be useful for dealing with Orochimaru. It's meant to contain a soul, also paralyzing that within it under an intensified gravity field, and let no chakra in or out. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out without my doing so." "As expected of you, Lord Jiraiya," Guy said wearily, lacking the usual energy in his voice. "What next?" "By now the snake will have gone to ground," he said. Until he makes his next move or we find another lead, we head back to the village and have the old man seal this coffin away somewhere no one can reach it. Naruto POV. Back in the Leaf Village, unaware of his mentor's struggles, Naruto slowly had Suzaku descend outside of Karen's house. It had gotten later than they expected, after they had finished dinner and dancing on the water's surface. But all good things had to come to an end, and keeping Sakura all night to refresh the illusion would have been selfish. Speaking of Sakura, his clone was in the process of escorting her home. The clone had created another clone to send the memories to him mid-flight and allowed him to recall what the pair had discussed, including the fact that Sasuke was being distant again. While his clone had said to leave it to Kakashi, he should probably look into it on his own since, even if he was a Chunin now, they were still part of the same team and the fact that she shared that information with him meant that she was really worried. He'd also have to really thank Ayama for everything. She'd want to know how the date went, and he felt like he owed her for the food and the advice. Oh, and because Sakura wanted the recipe for what she had made for dinner. Once Suzaku landed, Naruto once again helped her down from atop of it. Only this time a giggle tickled his ears instead of a surprised yelp. It matched the bright smile on Karen's face as she looked him in the eyes. "That was so much fun," she said, folding her hands together behind her back. "I didn't expect something like that. You really put a lot of work into it." Naruto grinned brightly at that. "Glad you enjoyed it. Now I've got to think of something to return the favor." She placed her hands on her chin and thought. "You've set the bar pretty high, so it'll have to be something really special. It'll take me some time to figure out what to do." "You don't need to. It's just." His words died as Karen leaned in to kiss him once again. This time it was on the lips, a feather-soft touch that blossomed in his mind like fireworks. There was no single word to describe it. It was hot as the sun, yet it was sweet as honey, a delightful feeling that robbed him of the ability to think as the kiss lingered for what seemed to be a lifetime. Then she pulled away with a blush on her cheeks that matched the one that painted Naruto's, both a deep shade of red that was the same as her hair. "I know I don't have to, Naruto," she said afterwards, brushing her hair back awkwardly. "But I want to. Because if I do my best and it makes you happy, then I'll be happy too. That's what I want our relationship to be like, where we're happy because we make one another happy. Don't you?" Lost for words, Naruto nodded dumbly. "Anyway, we have a big day tomorrow at the Ceiling R&D building." Karen opened her door. "I'll see you there, okay?" He was still lost for words until Suzaku prodded him with its beak to snap him out of his stupor. "Right, see you then. Have a good night." "You too, Naruto." She gave him a wave before shutting the door gently. Naruto stood there for a moment longer to center himself. He vigorously shook his head to clear it of the warm haze that loitered with memories of the kiss as he climbed onto Suzaku's back, to little avail. The cool night air as it flew back towards his home did a much better job of sobering him up as he headed back towards his apartment. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46. Saratobi read the scroll that was delivered to him courtesy of a messenger toad inside of his own home with a weary frown as it reported on Jiraiya's chase and the conclusion. Orochimaru had eluded them again. Not only that, but Jiraiya theorized he used Anko Midarashi's body in order to bring himself back and was using it as his current vessel. They couldn't be completely certain on the method of how the cursed seal acted as a means of transferring his soul into a vessel. Whether he booted the soul of the victim out or some other means was alien to them. Their only hope of understanding it would be investigating the cursed seal on the captive that Anko had sent to the village. Inoichi's more invasive method of mind reading, done with the Hokage's consent given her affiliation, crimes against their village, and the urgency of the situation, had rendered her brain dead. From there, they could keep her body alive while they poked and prodded her seal until they could understand it well enough to find a way to remove it without the risk of death. To find a way to free Sasuke Uchiha and Karen Uzumaki from sharing the same fate in the future. But, for all intents and purposes, Anko Midarashi was among the dead now. She would have to be added to the memorial stone. Her charge, Karen, would also need to be informed given the circumstances. A weary sigh left his mouth at the thought. Anko was a bright child and promising Kunoichi. More than anything she regretted her affiliation with Orochimaru and proved her loyalty to their village time and time again. Yet this was how it ended for her, used to return the man she hated the most in the world back to the land of the living. Back to threaten their village in due time, because he didn't kill Orochimaru the first time his treachery came to light. His fingers trembled as they curled into fists. If he had killed him back then, the betrayal of Sand and this would not have happened. His former student wouldn't have mutilated his very soul into something so monstrous, denied their village founders their final rest, and the chains shackling Jiraiya to chase after him would never exist. Ba thump. NGH, his fingers fell over his chest, grasping for his heart. Since that day his age had been catching up to him. Even with Tsunada's help, he would not stave off death forever. The question was, would he die before he corrected this travesty, or leave behind an immortal monster to haunt their village until it was naught but ashes? For now, he would deal with the coffin containing their village founders. He would have it taken to the sealed hall on the outskirts of the village. There it would be stored away along with other forbidden objects and left until they could find some way to return their souls to where they belonged. Naruto House. Naruto was roused the next morning by his alarm clock, its constant ringing reverberating in his skull. He groaned as he sat up in the bed, the sleeping cap's tail brushing against his cheek as he rubbed his eyes. The fog of slumber clouded his mind and left him wondering why he was getting up so early on a weekend as he yawned. "Did you sleep well?" a feminine voice asked from next to him. "I guess." His eyes snapped open as he registered the voice, driving the lethargy from his mind. "Karen." "Good morning," Karen Uzumaki said from her seat at the foot of the bed. "I didn't startle you, did I?" "A bit." Fully awake now, he scratched his cheek as he looked her up and down. Karen was wearing a lavender blouse that covered her arms and fell down to her hips. Her pants fell down to her socks and a pair of open-toed sandals. "How long have you been here?" "An hour or two ago." "I didn't want to wake you up by knocking, so I figured that I would just." Karen shifted her eyes to the door, looking away from him as she admitted the truth. "I picked the lock since it was part of my training and then watched you for a bit while you slept." "That was risky," Naruto said in warning. And, if he had to admit it, the part about her just watching him sleep for a while was a bit creepy. If an Anbu patrol caught you doing that, it could have caused problems. "I had my mind's eye active," she explained. "That's also how I knew you were asleep." Naruto shook his head. "That's not the point. You shouldn't risk yourself like that just because you didn't want to wake me. It would have been weird to explain it to the old man if you were caught somehow." She looked down at her hands as her fingers curled around the hem of her blouse. "Yeah, I kind of figured that much after I was already inside. It just seemed like a good idea at the time. I'm not sure why, though. I've been feeling a little off balance since the end of the date where Naruto felt a weight drop into the pit of his stomach when she pressed two fingers to her lips to get the point across about their kiss the previous night. "Did I do something wrong?" Karen shook her head. "Originally, I was just going to give you another kiss on the cheek that time. But then I impulsively kissed you on the lips, despite telling myself during the date I didn't want to scare you off. I played it off well, but after I shut the door my heart was pounding and my thoughts were scrambled. I couldn't tell if you enjoyed it or were as confused as me or if I had left a bad impression, and I'm rambling now." Naruto realized this was probably the most flustered he'd seen Karen. She always carried herself so well under normal circumstances, so he kind of expected her to be more or less the same after the date. But now it was like a switch had been flipped. "If it's gotten you this bothered, we should talk about it." She hummed lowly as she considered it. "You're sweet, Naruto. But I'd rather not try to explain what I'm feeling to you out of fear that I'd spook you." Okay? "Well, what about talking to Yamane then?" he asked, recalling the advice she'd given him. "You know her, she knows about us, and we still have time before we need to get to the ceiling R&D building for the mask thing. If we go now, I'm sure she can help you sort things out, and I did promise to tell her how it went." Karen bit her lower lip in thought for a moment. Then she nodded, her red hair swaying with the motion. "Yes, I think that'd be best. I'll be able to concentrate better once I get it off my chest." "All right, I'll make a clone to go with you while I go take a shower and get ready for the day," Naruto said, rising to his feet. "It'll dispel once you get there, and you'll be able to talk in private until I'm ready to meet up there. Afterwards, I'll see about getting a copy of my key made for you later today." Ramen Ichiraku. Ayama did expect to hear from Naruto the next day about how his date went. So, when he came with Karen this morning and told her that it went well, she was glad for him and promised to write down the recipe for his other little friend who helped him. However, she didn't expect that Karen would want to talk to her afterwards and for Naruto to be a clone. But she was always willing to lend an ear to a friend of Naruto's. So she took the girl back into the shop while her dad manned the front and heard her out, and it proved to be the smart thing to do, considering what she told her about breaking into his room to watch him sleep. "You know, I was originally planning on doing the big sisterly thing and warning you against breaking Naruto's heart," Ayama said after listening to her explain herself. "But now I'm a bit more worried about you moving too fast with him." "Me too, actually," Karen said, placing her hand over her heart. "Normally, I act a lot more rational and wanted to take things slow with Naruto. But since last night something has changed. I've been feeling like it's all boiling inside of you?" Ayama guessed, to which Karen nodded. "What you're feeling is pretty natural. Love is a really powerful thing, especially for people who haven't had much experience with it. That's why I wanted to take things slow," she said. "But my impulse control slipped twice in less than 12 hours, first with that kiss and then entering into his home like that. They both seemed like a good idea at the time, even though I should have known they weren't and realized that after the fact. Well, that's probably because there's no more uncertainty since the date. Think of the situation like," she looked around for something to explain it better and settled on a pot. "Like a pot of water simmering in a low flame. Before, Naruto hadn't given any sign he was willing to commit, so you kept the flames level. With me so far?" Karen nodded. "And I'm guessing that date essentially turned up the flames and set the pot to boiling?" "That's right," Ayama said. "Now imagine a bunch of noodles being thrown into the mix as well. Noodles make a pot of water boil over the edges really easily because there's a lot of things inside of it that come out under the heat. If you relate the pot to your self-control, the water to your emotions, the noodles towards love, and the excess that comes out under the heat being hormones, then when it boils over would be when your impulse control slips because your emotions have gotten too high to control, which explains the kiss on the lips and bedroom invasion." She frowned a bit as a light blush painted her face. "Do you have to frame that last part that way?" Ayama shot her a stern glance. "Naruto's becoming more mature, but he's still innocent at heart. He probably didn't consider the implications of you slipping into his home and watching him sleep, but I think we both know that you at least entertained the thought of kissing him again while he wasn't awake, didn't you?" She didn't deny it outright. "I didn't go through with it. This time," Ayama stressed. "Next time it could be worse, especially once puberty really kicks in. You're mature for your age and can reason out why it's a bad idea, but the raw emotion is still there and it can consume you. Then, once it settles, you'll just have regrets. Trust me when I say a lot of people my age have done things like that because they didn't have someone to explain it to them like I am now." "Does that include you?" Karen asked. Almost," she admitted. "There was a guy who I found attractive and thought he was pretty cool. Not shinobi cool, but by civilian standards. Dad didn't like him though, so we kept things a bit of a secret. It added a hint of spice to things that way." "So what happened then?" "Naruto came in one day after looking like he had been crying because of something at the academy back when he was younger," she explained. "Since he's a little brother to me in all but name, he was my priority and I spent the evening lifting his spirits rather than leaving work early to go off with the guy. I could understand him being upset at that because I made a commitment and didn't see it through, but then he called Naruto a brat and that pretty much cut the flames off right then and there." "Jerk," Karen said to that. "Yeah, he was." Ayama sighed. "Anyway, back with the analogy of boiling noodles. You stop them from overflowing by adding a little oil to it. That's what you need to do the equivalent of keeping it boiling without spilling over. I'll give you some advice on that front." "Thanks," Karen said, before licking her lips nervously and adding, "Can we not tell Naruto about this?" "Your secret's safe with me," Ayama assured her. "Now, about that advice. Konoha R&D building. It should be done charging in a few seconds," exclaimed the enthusiastic ceiling researcher said from behind the glass. After her talk with Ayama, Naruto had arrived and went with Karen to the ceiling R&D building. There they found Naru waiting, despite it being relatively early in the morning. Considering the rings under her eyes, Karen found herself wondering if the woman even slept last night or spent the entire time making sure everything was ready for them. Well, at least Byaku's mask has been remade, Karen thought to herself. They had finished reconstructing it, with Naruto currently testing its capabilities, while she would be here to start the interview with the Divine Priestess first. Naruto would be handling the Divine Priests that were considered less of a hazard than the Reaper afterwards, they would save that one for last. "And we're all set," Naru said through the speakers. "Go ahead, Karen-chan." "Okay." Turning the priestess's mask over, Karen peeled off the chakra-storing slip that contained Naruto's yang chakra. Then she used a scalpel they provided to make an incision into her thumb, providing the blood to activate it. From the mask emerged a feminine figure of flowing, white robes. A translucent ribbon woven from the air itself curved around its arms and back, swaying softly to a non-existent breeze. Landing before her daintily in the second focal circle, the divine priestess took form for the first time since the day that they found them. "You summoned me, child of the Eddies," it spoke in a soft voice that tickled her mind through their spiritual link. "How may I be of aid to you?" "It works," Naru said. "We heard that on this side. You can start the discussion." Taking a deep breath, Karen began. "Tenyo, I've summoned you in the hopes that you could tell me more about yourself and the others, your capabilities, your origins, and the purpose of the divine gods. Why can't we summon them like we do you?" "The divine gods cannot be summoned through the means by which I stand before you," Tenyo stated. "I and the divine priests are messengers who act on their behalf and possess a fragment of their powers to aid those of the clan that dwelled by the Eddies. Should one need to call upon the divine gods, they must be prepared to sacrifice instead." "What do you mean?" Karen asked. "Those who seek the power of the divine gods must offer their body as a vessel and chakra as the means to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. The one who bears the mask upon their flesh becomes an avatar for them to descend and inhabit their bodies, allowing them to utilize power beyond their kin. But it is not without consequences, and should you attempt to do so as you are now, you will perish." Not eager to test it then, Karen decided before moving on. "You mentioned you and the divine priest have a fragment of their powers. What does that mean?" "I shall show you." Bowing its head slightly, the divine priestess's ribbon seemed to stretch out towards Karen. The moment it touched her forehead, her world melted as a memory that wasn't her own overtook her. She found herself standing in front of a beautiful red-haired woman who Karen recognized from one of the books she read. The woman dressed regally was standing there, cradling a mask with her hands tenderly as chakra flowed from her into it. Another vision quickly filtered in as that one faded. Karen found herself in the presence of that same woman decades later. Her red hair had faded to a gray and wrinkles lined her features, yet there was still an air of grace about her. Just as delicately as before, she cradled a mask in her grasp. Only this time she wasn't alone and handed it to another red-haired girl that Karen also recognized, instructing her to do the same. "Karen-chan, what's happening?" Naru's voice rang out abruptly. "You've gone silent. Say something if you're okay." I'm looking at a memory," Karen said, her eyes still those of Tenyo's as the ribbons flowed around her arms like water and touched the two Uzumaki women. "It seems like the priestess can use her ribbons to transfer memories that she observes or between people. Right now, I'm looking at one of Tenyo's memories of the ones responsible for maintaining the shrine and the masks within them before we stumbled across them." "We're not getting visual here," Naru said. "Can you describe them, and we can do research into them later on?" "I recognize them both," Karen said as the memory came to an end and the ribbons retracted from touching her head. "The first was Mito Uzumaki. She must have been the one who took care of them initially. But as she aged, she needed another person to do so, and she chose another Uzumaki to do so. Kushina Uzumaki. Naruto's mother would have been the one to take care of them after the passing of Mito. Taking into account they were probably neglected during the various wars since it was established, combined with the near extinction of their clan at some point during the last one, Naruto's mother probably only visited to charge them while leaving the temple in a state of disarray. And if she was the host of the nine-tailed fox before Naruto, and it had the same effect on her chakra that it did on his without purifying it, she wouldn't have been able to use them. A Jinchuriki probably had more worth to the village than the masks at that point since their clan was scattered. So, with her death upon Naruto's birth, it was likely that no one else would have known about it. Taking a deep breath, Karen addressed the divine priestess again. "So, that's your ability then? To share memories or take them while they're bound?" "To be precise, it is the ability to connect minds," Tenyo explained as more ribbons came into existence from the air itself. "Wherever the winds blow, my ribbons can touch, and thus all are connected. The divine god I act on behalf of has the ability to perceive and manipulate the threads of fate upon which all is bound on a conceptual level. Connecting minds between others to allow them to commune with one another. Connecting hearts between others to bind them in love. Should it be needed, even connecting to the forces of the natural world is possible, such as if one connected the sky and the land, the winds would churn into a twister and sweep the land into the sky. bringing about whatever change you desired through manipulating the metaphysical or conceptual bonds. It sounded absurd to Karen on some level. But she supposed that, if you were technically calling down a god to inhabit your body, then it would possible, theoretically. More worryingly, if that was what only one was capable of. What were the others capable of? End of chapter 46.